The wind howled through the trees like the anguished wails of the damned. Rain lashed against the old stone walls of Blackthorn Manor, a once grand estate now crumbling into obscurity. The mansion stood on the edge of the forest, its silhouette a dark blot against the moonless sky. For years, it had been abandoned, its halls echoing only the whispers of ghosts long forgotten by the living. But tonight, something was different. A solitary figure, cloaked in a long, tattered coat, approached the manor's iron gates. His name was Adrian Calloway, a historian obsessed with the obscure and the unknown. He had heard the rumors, of course, the tales that swirled around Blackthorn Manor like smoke. They said the house was haunted, that its inhabitants had been driven mad, consumed by their own secrets. But what intrigued Adrian most was the story of the manor's final night of glory, when the last of the Blackthorn family had vanished without a trace, leaving only a single, cryptic message carved into the walls: "The shadows whisper the truth, but only the dead may hear." Adrian had spent years piecing together the fragmented accounts of Blackthorn Manor, but none of them made sense. The facts were scattered, buried under layers of superstition and fear. But the historian in him couldn't resist. Tonight, he was determined to uncover the truth. The gates creaked open, as if welcoming him into the darkness. Adrian stepped onto the overgrown path, his boots sinking into the soggy ground. The air was thick with dampness, the scent of decay clinging to the ancient stones of the manor. With each step, the shadows seemed to stretch and shift, as though alive and watching. He reached the front door, its heavy wood splintered and warped by years of neglect. He pushed it open with a groan, revealing the once opulent foyer now reduced to ruin. Dust hung in the air, and the faint scent of mildew mixed with the acrid smell of old paper and forgotten memories. The chandelier above, its crystals long shattered, dangled from a single rusted chain. Adrian's lantern flickered as he ventured deeper into the house. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of his own breathing. As he passed through the grand hallway, his eyes were drawn to the faded portraits on the walls, images of long-dead ancestors, their eyes seemingly following him as he moved. At the end of the hallway, he found the door to the library, the heart of the manor's secrets. He had read in the archives that the Blackthorn family had been avid collectors of ancient texts, and Adrian hoped to find something, anything, that could shed light on their mysterious disappearance. The door creaked open, revealing rows upon rows of ancient books, their spines cracked and brittle. Adrian's heart raced as he stepped inside, his eyes scanning the shelves for anything of significance. Then, as if by instinct, his gaze fell upon a single, weathered book lying on a pedestal at the center of the room. It was bound in black leather, its pages yellowed with age. As he reached for it, a chill swept through the room, and a whisper, barely audible, seemed to echo from the shadows. "The truth lies within," the words lingered in the air like a cold breath. Adrian's hand trembled as he opened the book, the first page revealing a series of cryptic symbols and strange diagrams. As he turned the pages, the whispers grew louder, until they were no longer whispers at all but voices, low, guttural murmurs that seemed to come from all around him. And then, suddenly, everything fell silent. A shadow moved in the corner of the room, dark and unnatural. Adrian froze, his pulse hammering in his ears. The figure was tall and thin, its features obscured by the gloom. It stepped forward, its movement smooth and fluid, like smoke swirling in the air. Adrian's heart skipped a beat as the figure spoke, its voice a hollow echo. "You shouldn't have come, historian. The shadows do not reveal their secrets to the living." Adrian's breath caught in his throat. He could hardly move, his body frozen in place as the shadow slowly advanced. The figure seemed to stretch and twist, its form becoming more and more distorted with each passing second. The air in the room grew colder, and Adrian could feel the very walls of the manor closing in around him. He wanted to run, to flee from this nightmare, but his legs refused to obey. The shadows seemed to reach out toward him, as if they were alive, clawing at his skin, whispering in his ears. "The living do not belong here," the voice said again, this time more forceful. You seek the truth, but the truth is a prison. The Blackthorns learned this too late. The figure stopped just a few feet away, its presence suffocating. Adrian could barely make out its shape in the dim light of his lantern, but he could feel its eyes, cold and ancient, watching him. The shadows around the figure writhed and swirled, as if they were alive, feeding on the fear that radiated from Adrian. Forcing himself to speak, Adrian tried to steady his voice. Who are you?" he asked, his throat dry, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure did not answer immediately. Instead, it reached out with a long, skeletal hand, pointing toward the book Adrian had just opened. "The answers are in the pages you disturb," it whispered. "But the cost is not one you can pay." Adrian's mind raced. He had to know more. He couldn't leave without understanding the full story of Blackthorn Manor, no matter the price. "I don't care about the cost," he replied, his voice trembling but defiant. "I need to know. Why did the Blackthorns disappear? What happened to them?" The figure seemed to pause, its expression unreadable, before it spoke again, this time in a tone that felt more like a warning than an answer. "The Blackthorns made a pact with the shadows that they could never undo. They sought immortality, but the price was their souls." The room seemed to grow even colder as the words settled in. Adrian could feel a weight pressing on his chest, suffocating him, but he refused to look away from the figure. "What do you mean? What happened to them?" The shadow's lips curled into something that could almost be mistaken for a smile, though it was more of a twisted grimace. "The shadows took them, piece by piece. The house itself became a prison, and they were trapped within it, bound by their own greed. Now, they exist only in the darkness, lost to the world of the living." Adrian's heart sank. He had been right to be curious about the Blackthorns, but now he wished he hadn't come. The truth was more horrific than he could have imagined. The Blackthorn family had made a deal with something far older and darker than any human should have dared to summon. And now, that darkness was here, in the very room with him. A gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing Adrian's lantern, plunging him into absolute darkness. The whispers rose again, filling his ears with maddening voices, all speaking at once. The shadows seemed to close in on him, their voices growing louder, more frantic, until it felt as though the walls themselves were alive. Suddenly, Adrian felt a cold, clammy hand grip his wrist, pulling him toward the center of the room. He tried to scream, to fight back, but the grip was like iron, unyielding and suffocating. His vision blurred, and in the darkness, he thought he saw figures, shadows of people, their faces twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. The Blackthorns. Adrian was being dragged toward them, toward the very source of their torment. "You wanted the truth," the figure's voice echoed, now all around him. "Now you will know it." And then, in an instant, everything went black. Adrian awoke with a start, his heart racing, his body drenched in cold sweat. He gasped for air, trying to steady his breathing. The library was gone, the shadows vanished, and he was lying on the cold, damp ground outside the manor. The gates loomed before him, open as if he had never entered. But something had changed. His mind was foggy, his thoughts fragmented. He tried to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to him like a second skin, but it wouldn't leave. He couldn't remember how he had left the house, or what had happened in the moments after the darkness consumed him. He stood up slowly, his legs unsteady, and looked back at Blackthorn Manor. The mansion still stood, its windows dark and unwelcoming, as though nothing had happened. But Adrian knew better. Something had shifted. Something had followed him. And then, from the depths of the house, came a whisper, a voice he recognized, though he hadn't heard it in years. "Adrian, you cannot escape us." Adrian's heart pounded in his chest as the whisper echoed through the cold night air, a sound that seemed to come from the very ground beneath his feet. He turned, his eyes scanning the dark expanse of the manor. The gates creaked as though beckoning him to return, but Adrian didn't dare move closer. He knew better than to be drawn back into that place of death and madness. Still, he couldn't shake the sensation that something was wrong, something was following him. The air felt thicker, colder than it had before, as if the very world around him had shifted, taking on an unnatural quality. He glanced down at his hands, expecting to see them trembling with fear, but instead, they were eerily still. It was almost as though he had come to a standstill in time. Adrian's thoughts raced. He had left the manor, he had escaped. But had he truly escaped? Or had something else followed him out, lingering just beyond the veil of reality? The whisper came again, this time louder, clearer, and more insistent. Adrian, do not turn your back on us. His pulse quickened, but he refused to look back. Instead, he turned on his heel and began walking briskly down the overgrown path that led away from the manor. He had to get out. He had to get somewhere safe, anywhere that wasn't Blackthorn Manor. His mind was a jumble of confusion and fear. What had happened to him in that house? What had he seen? Those shadows, those twisted, maddening forms, they hadn't been of this world. And that figure, the one that had spoken to him with such cold finality. It was like something ancient, something that had existed long before the Blackthorns had set foot in the manor. Suddenly, the ground beneath Adrian's feet trembled. It was subtle at first, like the faintest vibration, but then it grew stronger, until the earth itself seemed to shudder. He froze in his tracks, his heart thudding loudly in his ears. The air grew heavy again, and he could feel the familiar presence of something unnatural stirring behind him. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the dark, looming figure of the manor in the distance, its silhouette barely visible against the thick, inky sky. He could feel his breath catch in his throat. The manor wasn't just a place anymore. It was a force, a living thing, hungry and waiting. You cannot leave, Adrian, came the voice again, more forceful now, as though it were in his mind, as though the shadows themselves were creeping through his thoughts. Adrian staggered backward, panic seizing his chest. He could feel the coldness of the house reaching out toward him, and in the darkness, he saw the faintest glimpse of a figure, a face, pale and hollow, staring at him from the window of the manor. He turned and ran, his legs moving faster than he thought possible, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to flee, but the shadows were faster, always just one step behind him, following him through the trees, through the mist. They were everywhere, stretching and shifting, curling like smoke around his ankles, whispering his name, calling him back to the house. He stumbled, crashing to the ground, his hands scraping against the cold earth as he tried to push himself up. The shadows closed in, creeping along the edges of his vision, their forms becoming clearer, distorted, writhing shapes that seemed to pulse with an eerie, otherworldly energy. He could feel their cold fingers grazing his skin, could hear their whispers rising to a deafening roar. Adrian's mind was spiraling. What was happening? What was the truth behind the Blackthorns and their cursed pact? And why was he being dragged into it? He couldn't escape. The shadows surged forward, and Adrian found himself being pulled back toward the manor. No matter how hard he struggled, no matter how fiercely he fought, it was as though the darkness was a part of him, a part of his very soul, tugging him into the void. And then, in a sudden burst of clarity, Adrian understood. The Blackthorns hadn't disappeared. They hadn't been trapped by the shadows. They were the shadows. Their souls had been absorbed, transformed into the very darkness that now clung to him, that now chased him across the land. The shadows were the Blackthorns themselves, lost, twisted, and consumed by their own hunger for power. Adrian's chest tightened as the realization hit him. He wasn't being hunted by the shadows, he was becoming one of them. The truth has always been in the darkness, came the voice again, now a chorus of many. The Blackthorns are eternal, and so are you. With that, Adrian's mind shattered. When he awoke again, it was not in the forest, not on the path he had fled down. It was within the confines of Blackthorn Manor, the very place he had thought he'd escaped. His body was cold and numb, and as he lifted his hand to his face, he felt the unmistakable touch of stone, cold, smooth, and unyielding. The walls of the manor surrounded him, their shadows stretching long and dark, embracing him like an old friend. He realized then that the shadows had never truly let him go. They had claimed him. His eyes darted to the floor, and he saw them, the Blackthorns. They were no longer human, but fragments of their former selves, twisted and lost in the endless void of shadow. Their faces, their voices, their very souls, now belonged to the darkness. And Adrian. Adrian was no different. He tried to scream, but there was no sound. The shadows had swallowed him whole, and as he looked into the abyss, he realized with dreadful certainty that the Blackthorns hadn't been lost to time. They were never gone. They had only been waiting. And now, Adrian was one of them.